With conscience then, we start with two large boxes at the top. Both of these are going to be Aquinas' first part called ratio. So first box, we might as well add that quote in as well. So just add that quote into the first box as well, just on passing. So St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, says that conscience is the mind of man making moral judgments. 2, 4, 6, 7 words, nice and short, easy to remember, good place to start an essay. The mind of man making moral judgments. Knowing Aquinas, he probably does mean man as in man as well, since he thinks women are defective. So he probably is meaning that conscience is linked with men. But you probably don't want to open that can of worms in a conscience answer. Yeah, throw it in passing brackets if you wish. So, ratio. Ratio is reason and the ability to make moral judgments. You need to know what ratio means. So, ratio is reason and the ability to make moral judgments. Aquinas, unlike others, did not believe conscience was a special power or part of our mind, but linked with reason. So, many other thinkers, including Augustine, all saw it as this intuition, this special power that people had from God, this guide that God gave us to work out moral judgments. What Aquinas is saying is no, it is linked with reason. Ratio distinguishes us from other animals, and only humans deliberate meaning thinks about things, weighs things up. We deliberation over moral matters. Should we do this? How about this? What about this? And therefore, ratio is fundamental aspect of how we are created. It's a fundamental part of us, a part of why we are made in Imago Dei, the image of God. It's an act of working things out, and it helps us to connect with the eternal realm, to the divine truth, remembering things like the hierarchy moral code. So Aquinas that did natural law. Natural law, you have the hierarchy moral code, human law, natural law, divine law, eternal law. This links in with this idea of eternal law or eternal realm, being the mind of God. Your conscience, your ratio, links you to the mind of God. So the divine truth being things like scripture, the priest, etc. So this helps you in order to, conscience helps you into the divine and therefore the eternal realm. If at any point you've got questions, this should all be quite straightforward. So Aquinas would argue that we're all given ratio, we are all given this because we as humans are made in the image of God with this ability. Box to the side is also for ratio. Ratio, again, reason and ability to make moral judgments. This means morality is not just following the laws of the land or what is culturally, socially or politically normal. This is very, very important. Conscience and ratio is not just about following the laws of the land. Must do this, must not do that. It's not about that. It's about stepping beyond what is culturally, socially or politically acceptable or normal. Similar to how Jesus was seen as Jesus the rebel. This idea that Jesus used his conscience, used his reason, his ratio to go beyond what was socially acceptable at the time. Hanging out with females, for example. Or helping the outcasts of society. Ratio reaches beyond what is socially acceptable to the higher morality. You can also link this to Bonhoeffer, for example. Pope Benedict reflects on Jesus' trial and says this: they are shouting the same thing that everyone else is shouting, and in this way justice is trampled underfoot. When Jesus was on trial, because it was a special day or something like that, there was another man as well on trial with Jesus at the same time. And so whoever was doing the trial, I think it might have been Pontius Pilate, because I know Pontius Pilate did put Jesus to death. So Pontius Pilate, whoever it was, said, you can save this to the crowd, you can save one of these men. And the crowd all started to shout the same thing. That same thing was, save the other man, crucify Jesus. And so often people say this is where the problems between Judaism and Christianity came about, because most of the crowd were Jewish. And so that's where this conflict comes. However, what's obviously always forgotten is the fact that we needed Jesus to die in order for Christianity to be established anyway. However, back to Pope Benedict's point, what he's saying is everybody joined the same thing. Everyone went along with each other. And in this way, justice, that is not letting Jesus die, got trampled away. This can also be linked to acts of social disorder where conscience can be overruled and ignored, such as the Holocaust. Social disorder, people being bystanders, people letting Jews in the streets be publicly and physically threatened and abused, and therefore your conscience was overruled. People thought we cannot do things because something bad would then happen to us. So they squashed their conscience, they overruled their conscience and followed what was socially acceptable. That was, under Nazi Germany, that Jews were taken away. So this is about listening to your conscience above all other things. Conscience comes first, even if what your conscience is telling you goes against the law, like what Bonhoeffer did. Problems, again, though, of course, when you go against the law with your conscience. One, it'll never stand up in court. Oh, my conscience told me to do it. Who cares? So it'll never stand up in court. Second of all, what you again bring in the idea of Stephen Fry's one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Your conscience is telling you to break the law. Does that include things like suicide bombing? Your conscience is telling you that that is the right thing to do. Your conscience is telling you that that's the act you should commit. But again, there comes problems with that. Box underneath is split into two. One part is for sin. Oh, are we all right? Did we not get it? Say again? Oh, that's fine. Bless you then. One box synderesis, the box to the side conscientia. If you get a question in the exam on conscience, one, it's an easy one. Conscience is a very, very easy topic now, which means you have to know your words. You have to be sharp on your arguments. So, synderesis, within every human, there is a principle called synderesis. This is what directs us towards good and away from evil. Hence, synderesis rule, do good, avoid evil. But there is also sensuality. This is within us and it tempts us to do evil. Hence the Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit, etc. So we have sensuality within us. But worry not. Whilst both play a part in humans, that's the synderesis and sensuality, Aquinas, unlike predecessor Augustine, believed that we automatically lean towards goodness before evil. Augustine says we all pick evil because we're born that way. Whereas Aquinas is saying no, we all lean towards goodness first, even if we are slightly tempted by sensuality. You need to evaluate that. Do you agree? Do you believe that humans are naturally inclined towards goodness over evil? Or do you think, like Augustine, that we are naturally inclined towards doing bad things? Humans can use ratio to cultivate the habit of synderesis. Basically, synderesis is the process of conscience. It's the thought process where one leans towards goodness as guided by ratio and away from guilty pleasures. So synderesis is the process of using reason. Conscientia attached to the box is conscience in action. I remember it because it ends in an IA. Conscience, I in A, action. Conscience in action. It is when ratio is used to inform synderesis and the result is acting upon your conscience. The act is conscientia. Thought process synderesis whilst using reason. So it's like a layering, it's like building a house. So your first level is your synderesis, which uses your reason, which is a bit like the cement. That builds then into the conscientia, which is your actual action. So it builds up. This also for me is very, very good. Why? Because many conscience arguments, we're going to look at a few on the last slide, just talk about that process of angel and devil. What is right and what is wrong. What conscientia is talking about is actually acting upon it. It's not just the thought process, it's actually doing something about it. And then you have another quote from Aquinas, all in Summa Theologica, obviously. It is clear that conscience is an act. 8 words, nice short quote, manageable to remember, and it epitomises the whole of Aquinas' argument. Conscience is an act. Not as in an act like you're pretending. An act as in it's an action, it's something that you do. Feel we okay? Yeah. No, thanks. The final section then of Aquinas' argument, you have ratio, synderesis, conscientia, and then you have ignorance. Ignorance, other than guilt. Guilt comes in later when we do it with Freud as well. So ignorance is the final part for Aquinas' argument at this point. Box underneath then is split up like the slide. You've got a long thin part for the top part, and then you have vincible, invincible, and the boxes attached underneath. So, ignorance. You must follow your ratio and conscience at all times, even if it leads to a wrong choice. By using your ratio in line with synderesis, whatever it is directing you towards is right. So you must follow it, you must do it. However, Aquinas did recognise that mistakes can be made. Again, this is a very, very good part of his argument. He's saying that mistakes can be made because often they argue that, often religious people such as Augustine argued that conscience was God-given and therefore it questioned how can you do wrong things if God's giving you it. Whereas what Aquinas is saying is no, sometimes you can get your conscience wrong. Sometimes your reason might not be correct, and he's going to explain how that's possible in a second. So he does recognise conscience can be mistaken, and that's because your sensuality has educated your views in the wrong way. Sometimes if a mistake is based on right ignorance, you are morally blameless. So if it's right ignorance, you are without blame. If it's based on wrong ignorance or ignorance, you are to blame. And so this is where he brings in the 2 different types of ignorance. One is one that you can help, one is one that you cannot help. Vincible, bad. Invincible, good. So in the little boxes underneath, vincible ignorance is where you can be held responsible. This is, you should have known better. Not an excuse, and you are therefore morally culpable for your acts. Invincible is where you are not responsible because you think you're acting in your best knowledge, you were reasonably informed, but you nevertheless make a mistake. Aquinas believes that God would not condemn such an act. So, for example, you get into your car and you run over someone's cat. In the vincible ignorance example, it's because you're drunk. And you got in that car and you should have known better. You should not get into the car when you've had a drink. The opposite account would be invincible. You get into that car sober, but your brakes don't work. You don't realise your brakes don't work, and therefore you run over the cat. You cannot be held morally responsible for that because you were acting in your best knowledge that you thought your brakes were working and they weren't. And so one way you can be held responsible because you are ignorant invincible ignorance. On the other side, you acted because you thought it was the right thing. This is all linked as well to interior exterior acts. You remember, like your apparent and real goods. Apparent goods are a bit like invincible ignorance. You think you're doing the right thing, even though something that comes out isn't in line with telos or purpose. So very, very similar. Don't forget, it's all the same argument, it's all the same person. This again is a standalone topic. You are not expected to apply this to sex and relationships, euthanasia or business. So you need to give your own examples. Even better though, because where we're going in a second, is Aquinas gives us his example. You might remember his example. Do you remember it? Yeah, when you sleep with someone else's wife. Yeah, that's right. So, box underneath is for Aquinas' example, and then we finish off with some strengths and weaknesses. The second side is Freud. So this side is Aquinas, the second side is Freud. The example Aquinas gives then. So basically, conscience can be mistaken. Apparent goods are followed, not real goods. Therefore, conscience is fallible. Conscience is not perfect. But conscience can be mistaken through your own fault or not. So your own fault, vincible, not your fault, invincible. Here's Aquinas' example of invincible ignorance. Invincible, what you are not held responsible for. Are you convinced? His example is this. And this is taken again from Summa Theologica. If a mistaken reason bids a man to sleep with another man's wife, to do this will be evil based on ignorance of divine law he ought to know. But if the misjudgment is occasioned by thinking the woman really is his own wife and she wants him, then his will is free from fault. Such a celibate monk argument. Recognise uses the word ignorance in there. Recognise he uses the link to divine law, so it's in the hierarchy moral code of natural law. And so what he's arguing is if you sleep with another man's wife knowing that she's not your wife, then you're breaking divine law, which is against the Bible. Don't sleep with another man's wife, it's an adultery, and your head is in your own hands, or whatever the phrase is, the blood is on your own hands. Whereas if you sleep with another man's wife but you think she's actually your wife and that she wants you, then you're free from blame. That's a brilliant example to use in sex and relationships, using your sex ethics. So if you get a question on natural law and sex, for example, you can use that still. Any Aquinas-related questions? So we've just got to evaluate now. That's it. Hence why it is extremely straightforward. There is nowhere to hide though on this if you forget something. Okay. Box underneath then, one box is for strengths, one box is for weaknesses. Strengths. At the end of the day, Aquinas is highly influential. He's supported by the Catholic Church. From the Catechism of the Catholic Church, they argue that conscience formulates its judgment according to reason. For me, this is a massive strength of Aquinas' argument. He is one little monk, Dominican monk, that has influenced the most powerful institution in the whole world. That is pretty impressive. And so you've then got the link to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Catechism is where they have all the different teachings and views, etc. And they are then linking this idea that conscience links with reason or ratio. So you've got a direct link there. It also explains why conscience can sometimes be incorrect because you use your reason in the wrong way following apparent goods. It also has clear set authority because it's linked with the Bible. Everyone can experience reason, so this isn't just conscience for religious believers, this is conscience for everyone. And finally, it includes knowledge and reasoning as well as religion. So it's basically got a tick from every side. You're not religious, you can still use it. You are religious, you can also still use it. The ticks are just to show that they're strengths. Once again, don't forget, as it stands there, they are not evaluation because there's no critical word there. You're just stating a point. You need to do something with it. You need to integrate these into your answer. This is just as a springboard to help you in developing your own evaluation. You need to pick, are you team Aquinas or are you team Freud? You can't be both. Just because you side with Aquinas does not mean you are a person of faith yourself. You can be an atheist but still support Aquinas over Freud. So again, you need to pick which side you're on. The weaknesses. Some acts can never be morally blameless. The acts may still break the law and therefore entitle punishment. So regardless of your intention or following conscience. So you follow your conscience, it still will not stand up in law. Assumes good and evil are the same for everyone. So assumes when it says the synderesis rule that you do good and avoid evil, it assumes that everyone thinks the same things are good. It implies that goodness is universal, that everyone accepts what is good and evil. But the question is, are they? Are they the same for everyone? Our culture promotes that 16 is when you can start having consensual sex. Whereas in Saudi Arabia or other countries, you are seen as a woman once your period starts, so there is absolutely no issue with an older man marrying a 12-year-old, because if they've started their period, etc., they're seen as a woman, and therefore they can get married, they can have an arranged marriage, etc., whereas our culture would see that as not right. And so it assumes good and evil are the same. What happens if you don't believe in God? So it still argues that God gives you reason, so there's still links to God. It assumes no emotion is expressed. Isn't conscience more of an emotional link, not just based on reason? Are we really that rational? So do we really have ratio? Are we really that rational when it comes to making moral decisions? And can conscience conflict with reason? Can your conscience and what your reason is telling you two different things? So, for example, think of the child caught in the railway lines example. Your conscience is saying, must save your child. The reason's telling you, actually, I've got a train full of people that's 20, 30, 40 people that are going to die if I save my child. Conscience might conflict with reason. Are they always in line together? Aquinas argues they are in line together. You can criticise or question, are they? As soon as you are happy, turn over your sheet. We're going to have to pick up the speed slightly. Alright, so box at the top then is for this slide. Again, once covered Freud, once experienced, never forgotten. So that top box goes for this first part, please. Again, please summarise as much as you can, because you can always go back to the PowerPoint later. Freud created a theory of mind known as psychoanalysis. It provides an alternative account of conscience in his book, An Outline of Psychoanalysis and the Ego and the Id. And so his books outline a different view to conscience than Aquinas. Obviously, there was no direct parallel. He didn't deliberately go up against Aquinas. It's just that he has a different view as a psychologist. He argues that every single person goes through 5 psychosexual stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital. They go through these 5 stages in that order, and everybody goes through them. You do not need to go into excessive detail in your exam about those. Oral stage is 0 to 1, that's when you focus on your mouth. Anal is 1 to 3, that's when you focus on controlling your bowel movements. Phallic, 3 to 5 to 6, this is where your Oedipus and Electra complexes develop. So this is where your superego develops here. That is important because the superego comes back in later. So that's when, if you're a boy, you go through the Oedipus complex, linking in with ancient mythology, and that's when the boy falls in love with the mother. And so it's the idea that this isn't just a love of the mother, this is a sexual love. Dad's in the way, therefore they want to kill the dad, but they're worried that they'll get castrated. Therefore, they start to relate to the father because they think, oh, mother loves father. Therefore, if I act like father, then mother will love me in the same way. And so they start to relate to the father. They start to copy the father. They learn the father's morals, etc. And that's where the conscience starts to develop, by copying the same sex parent. The electoral complex is flipped, and it was done as a side view. Freud was not focused really on the girls' development, but it was mainly because girls have penis envy, and so therefore they think they've been castrated already, etc. So it was Oedipus complex that he really focused on, though, and that's the stage at which your conscience develops. Latency is when not much happens between 5 to 6 to puberty, and then genital is puberty, and that one kind of goes without saying. Each stage is associated with a particular part of the body. This is because the libido, or your sexual desire, focuses on that part of the body as its source of pleasure, frustration, or both. We then are going to move into the section underneath. You're going to have a box on id, a box on ego, and then a box on the superego. The triangle is obviously going to be for the iceberg. So, for the box underneath, again, you need to summarise. There's 3 personalities of, there's 3 aspects of the human personality. The id. The id is what develops first. It is entirely unconscious. That's the furthest bottom part of your iceberg. It is the central component of your personality. It's powerful, instinctive and primitive. Instinctive, it's instincts. Primitive, it's about evolution and about survival. It's driven by pleasure. It seeks immediate gratification. Basically, I want, and I want it now. Id, all about the pleasure. Your ego, in the box to the side, because it's not socially acceptable to seek immediate gratification for all of your desires, I want it and I want it now, doesn't work in society. Children learn to keep them in check. This is through the teachings of parents and wider society, like teachers. Thus, what is socially and not socially acceptable affects your ego. This develops into ways to satisfy your desires that are more acceptable. The ego mediates the desires versus social acceptability. So this weighs up. What do I want? How can I get it while still being socially acceptable? It is the reality principle. He gives the example of a horse and a rider. The horse is the id, the rider is the ego. So the ego is in control of the id, or the ego is in control, the rider is in control. Say that one again. The rider is in control of the horse. So good conscience. Again, there's quite a bit on this, so just do your best to get as much of it down as you can. Good conscience is effective operation of ego over id, where desires are achieved. So, for example, devouring a chocolate cake, whilst avoiding punishment from social authorities. Nobody's going to tell you off for eating chocolate cake, maybe Weight Watchers or Slimming World if you do that, though. But good conscience is when your ego is in control of your id. You can still satisfy it and do the things that you know, your naughty, guilty pleasures, whilst being socially acceptable still. So it's about doing the naughty things without being judged. All right, box to the side then is for superego. The slide goes into that box. This is superego, or the ego ideal. Last part of the human psyche to develop around the age of 5. So the superego develops around the phallic stage, Oedipus electra. It stores all of our internalised moral standards, so the moral standards that you've learned from the same-sex parent that you internalise, which means take it inside, of right and wrong acquired from parents and society, based on behaviourism. This is Skinner. So when you do something good, you're rewarded, and so you bank this in your superego. Oh, do it again because I want that reward. Or vice versa. Oh, I got a smack last time I did that. I won't do that again. Or I had to sit on. Sorry, children of nowadays don't get little taps around the legs, do they? You have naughty step now. So, oh, last time I did that, I got sat on the naughty step. I can't do that again. Superego stops us from breaking rules because of the fear of receiving punishment, criticism, or feelings of guilt. So superego is the voice that says, oh, remember last time you did that, you felt awful. That's that voice. Or it's the, you don't really want to go to prison, you don't want to get detention, you don't want to go on the naughty step, or whatever it is. And so the superego is what stops you breaking rules. So when we talk about conscience, we are not discerning the moral thing to do. So we are not thinking, oh, what should I not do? Is that the right thing? No, you're just thinking, what am I going to feel less guilty about? So what Freud is basically arguing is that we're not moral. We don't think, oh, you shouldn't do that because it's the wrong thing to do. No, he just says that you do it because you don't want to feel guilty. I won't do that because I'll feel guilty if I do. Freud saw consciousness as an aspect of the superego, and then he says this in one of his books. I don't know which book it is in, so if you want to use it, just Google the quote and it'll come up. But it's whichever book he wrote in 1933. He says that the superego observes the ego, gives it orders, judges it, and threatens it with punishment, exactly like the parents whose place it has taken. So the superego replaces the parental voice. It judges you, it threatens you with punishment, and so therefore the superego controls the ego controls the id. This is when Plato's charioteer comes in. You know, your rational, appetitive, spirited. The charioteer, the black and white horse, when one of your horses or the charioteer is too tight, that affects your personality. This is exactly the same for Freud. If your id is too in control, that's people that are like, it's all about me. Gimme, gimme, gimme. I want. Those are people that are far too controlled by the id. If they're really uptight and stringent and, oh, you can't do that because you'll get punished and that's naughty and you shouldn't, and they're very uptight, that's their superego is too much in control. And so this represents the different personalities of people. Box to the side, you're doing ever so well, everybody. The little triangle is just for that bit. So, again, it's a squish, but you know your triangle. You know your iceberg analogy. So, just squish it in there with the triangle image. So, top of the water is your conscious mind. It is where your conscience is based on guilt of disappointing parents. Just under the water level is your pre or subconscious. This is where you informed by society's behaviour and expectations. So this is where, apologies, I'll go back. This is where it is telling you, oh, you can't do that, or you can do that because of what society is expecting. And the bottom parts of your unconscious mind is where you have the love of your mother if you're going through the Oedipus complex. And so you will never ever get down to that point of your mind, even if you go, even hypnotherapy, etc., only goes just under the surface. Morality comes from human conscience, not God. That conscience is affected by parents, society, peers, etc. Strength then of Freud. This goes in the box underneath. He is the founder of psychoanalysis, and this is still used today. This is where you go and lay on the couch and you talk to somebody and they ask you questions and you basically spill your mind. That is still the process used today. Very, very influential. He is fundamental in the development of dreams, the mind, and the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious ideas. Very, very influential. Fundamental in the way that we see things like dreams today, because obviously dreams are when your subconscious affects your reality. Clear that parents and environment do affect our morals. He also recognises the importance of childhood and the role of parents in this development. So he recognises the importance of how your childhood affects you. Often if you've got problems with depression or anxiety or phobias, this is because something has stemmed from childhood. There's no way we're going to get this finished. So again, we'll just slow it down a little bit and we'll take our time and we'll finish whatever we don't get done on Thursday. Because there's not an awful lot left, but there's no point rushing it in the 10 minutes we've got. Further strength is it explains why all of our morals are so different, because they're affected by time, culture, society, parents. So each of our morals are different because we have different parents. Each of our morals are different because we have different upbringings. Your morals will be different from somebody that might live in London, different culture. Ooh, that's it. So that's it for that box. We then have weaknesses. We then bring in the argument from guilt and then the extra names. So you are doing very, very well still, but time is not on our side now. And I'm sure you're getting really tired. Excellent. Box to the side is weaknesses. Most of his approaches are unethical and unscientific. So most of Freud's arguments are based on the study that he did with little Hans. So little Hans was the little boy who most of the Oedipus complex is based on, because little Hans, when he was in the bath, asked his mummy to touch him there. And because of that, the mother then spoke to Freud or wrote to Freud, and Freud then developed this Oedipus complex where little boys have sexual love for their mothers, all from that. So not only is it unscientific because it's based on just 1 or 2 case studies, it's also unethical as well. What about children from single-parent families or modern families? Modern families meaning homosexual parents. What happens if you don't have a mother or a father? Freud would argue that you're going to grow up immoral, which is clearly illogical. Freud grew up in a time where it was 2.4, you know, you had 2 parents, etc. You had a mum and a dad, whereas now society is far more fluid as far as what families. You have step families, for example, as well. What happens if parents are immoral? This is a huge weakness. It implies that because you learn your morals from your parents, if your parents are immoral, it then implies that you also will be immoral. What about free will? If your father is a murderer, that then implies if you're a boy that you've then associated with your father, therefore you're also going to be a murderer. Do you not have any free will in the decisions that you make? Does this mean parents can be held responsible as well if their children are immoral? Your child's broke the law, they've learnt that from you, that's your fault. You are held responsible for what your children do. How is that fair? Your son killed somebody, You blame the parents. Oh, well, he must have learnt it from somewhere. He's learnt that from you. No. It also ignores later life experiences. Does your later life... Basically, you're now in the genital stage, but he's arguing that you've learned all of your conscience already. So it means now anything that you learn from now onwards will never affect your conscience. Do you agree with that? Do you think that you can't now make moral decisions or judgments? Also, is conscience morality unconscious? Is it really under the water level like he implies? Do you not have more control over what you believe you should and should not do? And do you only do it because you're trying to avoid feelings of guilt? Do you believe that you are good because you believe it's the right thing to do? I don't do that because I don't want to, that's not right. Or do you do it just because you don't want to feel guilty if you did do it? So you must engage with Freud, you must evaluate it again, bring this evaluation in throughout an answer, don't just clump it all in one go. Use your critical words as well. Don't forget as well, if you agree with parts of Freud and agree with parts of Aquinas' argument, use the words to an extent. So to an extent that bit works, but then that doesn't work. To an extent that works for Aquinas, but doesn't work. Okay, so use that language. Final bit that we'll do then, last little bit for today, you did ever so well. Box underneath then is for, so the long thin box is for guilt. This bit is very, very important. This is the final bit that the examiners really raise as part of something that you need to discuss. Guilt is the internal conflict in the mind, the struggle between what you desire, what you want to do, like your id, and what you feel you should or should not do. Interestingly for Freud, it is this inner turmoil or guilt that can lead people to doing bad things. It is not therefore a consequence of wrongdoing, it's the cause of future wrongdoings. So because you have this internal torment and torture, you actually end up doing things that you shouldn't do. You dig yourself an even bigger hole. So when you do something wrong, it's because of these feelings of guilt that lead you to do it, rather than getting the guilt afterwards. Guilt is the cause, not the effect. Again, you can discuss whether you agree with that or not. For Aquinas, on the other hand, so the examiners want you to be able to discuss and compare Aquinas' guilt to Freud's guilt. Aquinas says, on the other hand, it's God's grace that banishes guilt from a person. So it's all, again, to do with God's love on us that takes away our guilt. However, do these ideas really work? Does guilt make you do wrong things? Do you think guilt is eradicated and solved by God's grace? That is what, again, you discuss in your answer. The final bit for you to consider, so you don't have to make a note of it, but you can make kind of like a little mental brain thought, is this idea of the Garden of Eden. How would Freud explain what Adam and Eve did? How would Aquinas explain it? So, for example, Freud believes it's maybe because the id took over and you wanted the apple. I want it now. Aquinas would say it's because of invincible ignorance, that they should have known better. So again, you can use the Garden of Eden as a really good example. Up to this point is everything that you need to know. Aquinas and Freud is what you might get asked in the exam. In order to help plump it out, it's sometimes important to add a few more extra names into it. So these are extra names. You have one box for each, 2 slides left. 3 names, 3 boxes. So you've got a box for each. You've got Augustine in the first box, then Butler, then Newman. These used to be on the old spec, so these used to be must-learn names. Now they're just extras. Again, please don't get them confused though. These all have a religious view on conscience. So all of these believe that conscience is linked with God. Augustine, I've underlined the little bits just to help you pick it out. Augustine says it's actually the voice of God speaking to you. It's the voice of God. So when you hear that voice in your heads that tells you what you should and shouldn't do, that's actually the voice of God. You must take it seriously. Of course you must. If it's the voice of God, you can't ignore it. You see God as your witness. God sees everything you do. People are able to sense right or wrong because God reveals it to us personally. So it's this idea of a personal revelation from God about what you should do. God is your witness watching you. You must take it seriously, and it's the voice of God. You are welcome to use these to evaluate and to criticise. So if it was me in my exam, I would use Augustine to say why Aquinas is so much better, why Aquinas' ideas work more than the idea of God's voice in your head that you can't ignore. Butler in the middle says it's an essential part of being human, as does Aquinas. Aquinas argues the same thing, so you can get a nice comparison there. It separates us from animals, again, just as Aquinas argues. The idea of the imago Dei, the ratio, it's what sets humans apart. Like Aquinas, it is what we use to judge an action, good or bad. It's automatic and authoritative, so you don't ask for it, it just appears. It exerts itself spontaneously without being consulted, so you don't ask for it. It just happens. Again, you could question this idea of free will. What happens if you don't want to have this response? What happens if you don't want this automatic judgment? Final say in moral choices, God-given guide and should always be followed. And you have a nice quote from Butler there. It is our natural guide, the guide assigned to us by the author of our nature. Now, I quite like that quote from Butler, mainly because it doesn't say God, it says author of our nature. Obviously implying God though, of course. But this idea of natural, it's a natural guide. Final say though, automatic and authoritative. Even if you only learn one or two of these bullet points for each of the people, then use them as evaluation for or against Aquinas, making links and comparisons. This will really, really help you in an exam. Final one is Newman. Newman talks about these feelings of guilt again, but he calls it illative sense. So illative sense, the bit that's underlined, that's the feelings of guilt and responsibility. Rather than the use of reason and conditioning, he says again, conscience is the voice of the lawgiver. It is a messenger from God. So all three talk about this link to God, talk about how you must follow it and take it seriously. None of these explain why you do wrong acts. Aquinas is the only one that explains why acts are sometimes done wrong. All three of these believe that because it's the voice of God or the messenger from God, that it's therefore right. And again, you can criticise them to say, well, why do people do wrong things then? It also will never stand up in court. If you did something wrong and they said, oh, my conscience told me to do it, pointless regardless. You'd still have broke the law. Last slide, last two boxes. We bring in the non-religious views, Piaget and Fromm. Again, these are old spec names. Piaget is fantastic. Very, very influential man. If you do English language, you might have looked at Piaget and his developmental stages of language in children. You might have done him in sociology or psychology. One of the most recognised names within this. Very, very influential man. And he provides one of the most comprehensive theories of intellectual, cognitive, developmental psychology. So very, very influential man was Piaget. He proposed a universal series of stages throughout childhood, and he observed a game of marbles. So he watched children playing a game of marbles and saw how they interacted around this game. Obviously, marbles was the game of the time. And he says that there's two stages that we go through, heteronymous and autonomous. Heteronymous is about between the ages of 5 to 9. This is where a child looks beyond themselves for moral authority, the rules that must be obeyed, rules set down by higher authority, and it's immoral, acts are punished. This is where you believe that their rules are set, the rules cannot be broken, they've been set by a higher authority and you have to follow them. If any of you do school attachment or have young siblings or work in schools or anything like that, you will see this every day. I know when I used to do a lot of primary school experience, constantly, all day long you'd hear, Miss, he's done this and he shouldn't, Miss, he stole my pen, Miss, he's done this, Miss, he's flicked me, or whatever it might be, and they're constantly told tales. Why? Because they believe what they were doing was wrong, because that's what someone's told them. You must follow the rule, you cannot break the rule, and therefore, oh, mercy, they've done something wrong, okay? And so this heteronomous morality where they believe that these rules cannot be broken, and they're severe if you do. Autonomous is about 10 plus. This is when your personal code of conduct develops based on social perceptions and punishments are in proportion with actions. So this is where you start to become a bit more aware of, or someone stole your pen, yeah, not going to go to prison for that one. Someone's murdered somebody, yeah, that's quite bad. And so this is the idea that you recognise punishments in proportion with what you do, whereas a child just sees it all as very, very wrong. Hence why in the James Bulger case, they had to assess that the boys knew the difference between right and wrong and between lying and not lying. Because if the boys didn't know the difference between right and wrong, then they wouldn't have been able to punish them for the killing of James Bulger. And because they did, obviously, they went to court. Most adults have a mixture of the two, though. Most adults don't move purely into autonomous. Most adults do just follow rules because they're set down and cannot be broken. On the other side, we have From. He is so cute. He is so cute. From talks about the influence by external authority. Obviously, both of these are non-religious. Both of these believe our conscience does not come from God. We are influenced by external authority, parents, teachers, church leaders. So he does recognise the importance of the church, but he's not saying that he believes in God. These rules are internalised, taken on board by the person, and disobedience causes guilt. This guilt weakens our power and makes us submissive. So when you're disobedient, again, quite interesting links to Bonhoeffer potentially there, and you'll see even bigger links in a second. Disobedience causes guilt. That guilt eventually wears you down, weakens your snap and spark, and then it makes you submissive to what authorities say. Such as the Nazi government. From lived in Nazi Germany. He saw how the soldiers treated people, how society became submissive to authority based on these feelings of guilt. He called this the authoritarian conscience, where your conscience can be manipulated through guilt to do things that might be seen as wrong. So again, hence the Bonhoeffer link. Bonhoeffer saw this happening, and then he disobeyed the moral laws and the laws of society by taking his conscience down a more rebellious route. However, From later developed the authoritarian conscience into the humanistic approach. Far healthier, it gives us much more control over our conscience, we can assess and evaluate our own behaviour, and it's our real self. So the first one is basically your conscience can be manipulated and controlled, you can be brainwashed, whereas the second, he argued later in life, actually we are more in control of our conscience, it's more about living a full life, full potential. Again, you don't have to mention both Piaget and From, it gives you a little bit more substance to an essay, but again, use it only in evaluative sense, not in more content. So this is used against or for Aquinas, Freud, etc. Well done, everybody. Very, very nicely done.